Last year, at the age of 56, I got my first tattoo here on my forearm. It has the names of the 4 young adults that I consider my children. I had thought about getting this tattoo for years. At midlife, I was surprised and filled with gratitude to have children, plural, children, in my life, whom I have the privilege of loving. Eric was the first of my children, and for a long time the only. He is my child in the normal way. He was born almost 30 years ago during my first marriage, and with his father, Jerry, I raised him. He is an awesome young man. I could say more, but I adore him. Liz and Maggie, who are in their 30s, also on the tattoo, are the daughters of my husband, Gus. At various times in our relationship, when they were in their 20s, Gus's girls each lived with us. I am invested in them. I'm not their mother, but I feel very lucky that they agreed to be included in this tattoo. Kirsten, the youngest of my children, turned 21 in March. She's a junior in college. She's a history major, like I was. She is exploring a career in technical writing, very similar to the work I do as a medical writer. She's unbelievably emotionally intelligent, way beyond me. She is artistic and smart and organized. Of the 4 children on my tattoo, Kirsten is my miracle child. And you may have guessed from the title of the sermon where I'm going with this. I hope you won't mind if I pause and say here, I've never spoken publicly about my surrogacy experience. I've written about it a little, but I've never gotten up and talked about it. As you can imagine, this story is very close to my heart, partly because I'm going to be sharing with you about my relationship with my daughter, who is actually joining us live on the Zoom today. Good morning, sweetheart. The story is also unusual, and I'm going to share my vulnerability here. I think it's safe to say that most women could not imagine choosing to carry a pregnancy and give the child to someone else. When I first embarked on the surrogacy, I was careful about what I shared with people. The things that people could say could be startling and sometimes hurtful, and I was very wary. My UU fellowship in New York at that time was the most supportive community for me. Through the multiple attempts to conceive a miscarriage, the pregnancy that resulted with Kirsten, and her early childhood. So for me, telling this part of the story here, placing this trust in my new UU community, is very fitting. I also want to acknowledge that today, Mother's Day, is a complicated day for many of us, me included. Amanda and I chose readings today that center this complexity. Obviously, not all of us are biological mothers, or if we were, not all of us had an easy path through motherhood, and not all of us have easy relationships with our own mothers. The experiences of all parents, of all genders, and all children are intense and complicated. And this one is too. When I created the possibility of being a surrogate mother, I was married in my 30s. I was a college professor. I had a son who was in grade school. If you Google Lisa Baker surrogate, you will still find the essay I published in the New York Times almost 20 years ago that tells that origin story about my surrogacy experience. It was a long story of how I reached that place. But the important thing was I felt that surrogacy was a gift that I could give and that I wanted to give to a couple who otherwise wouldn't be able to have a biological child as I had been able to. In choosing to work with a gay couple, I felt like I was helping to create my ideal world. It was very much a part of my UU values, a world where loving couples who fervently want children are able to have them. The couple I worked with were strangers to me before we formed this plan together. And as a surrogate mother, I could have been paid, but I wasn't. Standing here, more than 20 years later, I am sort of amazed that that woman was me. Honestly, I look back and I'm proud of myself that I had that impulse. And I'm frankly astonished that I followed through with it. It's the most unconventional and the most courageous thing I've ever done. And I'm always proud of myself, that I actually did that and have continued to do this. When Kirsten was young, I was living in New York with my husband and my son, and her parents were raising her in California. Kirsten's dads always intended that Kirsten would know who I was, sort of similar to an open adoption, I think. I visited Kirsten a couple of times when she was a small child, and then not again for several years. But I was always in touch. I aimed to be the good aunt who always remembered birthdays and holidays and sent postcards or little tchotchkes when I was traveling. By the time Kirsten became a teenager, and Gus and I moved out here to Montana, she and I started to have the opportunity to see each other more. Kirsten's father, Andy, is older than I am. And one day, several years ago, sort of out of the blue, he surprised me by saying that he saw himself as Kirsten's past, and he saw me as her future. It felt like Andy was asking me to take a different place in Kirsten's life as she was reaching adulthood. And I was open. I had always felt that I'd want whatever relationship Kirsten asked of me. And it felt like a gift to have more family, just as it felt like a gift to have more family when I married Gus and his children became part of my family. Kirsten and I started visiting more. 3 years ago, she honored me with a ticket to her high school graduation ceremony in San Diego. That summer, my family included Kirsten in our big gathering on the East Coast. She bonded with the children of my two sisters. She became one of the cousins, as they call themselves. Kirsten and my son Eric, who are 8 years apart in age, now began to find things in common with each other. Kirsten doesn't have a big extended family, and my family have embraced her. And I feel so good about that and so grateful to my family. The more time Kirsten and I spent together over the past several years, the deeper our connection grew. We shared more and more of our stories and our feelings with each other. I gradually offered more support to her. For me, it became increasingly awkward then to refer to her as my birth daughter, which I had been doing her whole life. She felt like much more than that to me. And then a year or two ago, Kirsten said to me, "Can I just call you Mom?" So now Kirsten is my daughter. For me, this is like a miracle story, that this all happened this way. And it's a love story. And I Would hasten to add, this is not to be taken as a typical surrogacy story. For one thing, Kirsten is my biological child. When her dads and I embarked on surrogacy, going on 25 years ago, it was the last moment when people would still consider traditional surrogacy, using my egg, to be a reasonable option. Today, intended parents considering surrogacy are directed toward gestational surrogacy, where the egg comes from an egg donor, the embryo is created by in vitro fertilization, and another woman, the gestational carrier, carries the baby. I've often thought that when the egg comes from one woman and a different woman carries the pregnancy in a surrogacy, then no one would imagine that either of those women is the mother, which is the point, right? Legally speaking. And I think emotionally speaking, in most cases, so that the intended parents don't feel threatened. I assume that very few intended parents would be open to a really strong relationship between the surrogate and the child, as Kirsten and I have created. But in our case, Kirsten's dads were open, both of them. And I was open. And Kirsten reached into that possibility. And we are lucky. In the essay I published 20 years ago, I wrote about the visceral experience of letting go of Kirsten after she was born. I wrote back then, even though I knew she wasn't mine, had never been mine, she and I were one organism. Despite all of my mental preparation, I felt as if she had been ripped out of my body, ripped out of my arms. When I let go of newborn Kirsten and gave her to her fathers, I felt the loss in my body. However, interestingly, that deep experience of loss, it didn't stay with me. I cried for a few months, but then I never cried in the years after. In the years after, I only felt the contentment of bringing this beautiful child into the world and placing her exactly where she belonged. And it would have been enough if the story had ended there. But now, remembering Kirsten as a newborn, I find it just an exquisitely beautiful thing that I get to hold her again. I mean, literally hold her and hug her again now. Sometimes I wonder, when I hug Kirsten now, does my body remember that I carried her and gave birth to her? Like, does some part of me, my organism, still know that she's my biological child? I mean, really, I have no idea. But what does feel real to me, real, are the visits and the phone calls and the text messages and the gifts and that each of us have given each other over these years, where we have gradually come to know and trust and love and become committed to each other. Kirsten and I created this mother-daughter relationship. It's a huge gift in my life. And I tell her that all the time. As I think about Kirsten's and my story, I think about who we choose to mother and who chooses us to mother them. And even though it's Mother's Day, there's no need to gender this. I imagine many of us in this room, of all gender identities, have stories of deep parental relationships with stepchildren, with sons and daughters-in-law, with grandchildren, with adoptive and foster children, with children of our hearts who come to us through so many paths. The kind of relationship I have with Kirsten, I think many of us create with young people who enter our lives. As I think about Kirsten's and my story, I also, naturally, I think about biology. Does it matter that Kirsten is my genetic child? I mean, it's a fun parlor game. Like, do we have the same allergies? Do we have the same propensity to make spreadsheets, you know? Do we have the same eyes? I wish I had her cheekbones. I think about all of those stories we hear nowadays about DNA testing and adults reconnecting with their birth parents and their half-siblings. Many men who were sperm donors or who unknowingly fathered children many years ago are now being contacted by their biological children, courtesy of these DNA tests, and they are grappling in somewhat the same way that I have grappled with what kind of relationship they're open to and what kind of relationship their children are asking for. For so many birth children and birth parents, biology clearly matters. I would also venture to guess that in this room, as I started this story, many of you may have wondered immediately, was it her egg? I mean, that was probably the first question I was usually asked when I said, I'm being a surrogate, I'm carrying this baby for friends. The first question was usually, is it your egg? You know, which I will tell you, that's one of the reasons I was wary, because that felt to me like a very personal question. But it also says to me, the way that we think that and ask that, it says to me how much biology matters to so many of us. For me and Kirsten, the fact that I brought her into the world and I am her biological mother, obviously this was the jumping off point for our relationship today. But as I said before, for myself at this moment, at this point, I don't feel like biology is at all the important thing. I feel that the mother-daughter relationship that Kirsten and I are creating is a gift that is available to any adult and young person who commit to each other and who continually deepen their relationship with each other over time. Is that me? And it's that we, Kirsten and I, the adult and the child, creating these relationships that I keep coming back to. With Kirsten and me, it matters that both of us have chosen this relationship. It was not enough that I was open and available. It is not a one-way street. Kirsten had to want this too. There was a moment a few years ago, from the way things were going, I realized, you know, I had always known this could happen, but it actually seemed to be creating itself that Kirsten may want a real mother-child relationship with me. I remember being in my therapist's office in 2021, asking my therapist, like, what do I do with this? What do I make of this? Am I serious about this? Am I ready for this? Am I offering this? What does this mean? My therapist, you know, knowing me, she listened. And she wisely said, you know, let Kirsten lead. Let her show you what she needs from you. So I kept showing up. I planned trips. I offered support. I listened. I shared. And then there was that magic moment when Kirsten said, "Can I just call you Mom?" What matters is that both of us have chosen this relationship and that both of us continue creating it.